question for the MUA. I note that your supplemental submission your submission, I should say, goes quite specifically to the issue that the bill omits reference to ships and sea freight corridors as critical freight infrastructure, that only road and rail is mentioned, and that ships as carriers of oil are not captured in the bill's definition of critical liquid fuel asset or part of the distribution and supply for food and grocery sector. What is your recommendation to the committee? What is your concern there, and what is your recommendation to the committee in terms of how we might, how the bill might be improved? Did we lose Mr. Crumlin?
It's a sort of a faux pas of the modern world, isn't it? So even the bill extended the definition of infrastructure assets by another 22 and into areas such as critical electricity assets, critical food and grocery assets, freight infrastructure, those types of things, gas assets, liquid fuel. Didn't mention shipping, and there's no mention to shipping that's embedded in all of the issues that this critical infrastructure bill is seeking to address. Now, the 6,000 ships visit Australia every day. We're the fourth largest user of ships in the world. Most of them are registered in places like Panama and, the Caribbean and those types of places. There's a form of tax evasion and a sidestep regulation. So many of them operate full-time on the Australian coast under the current laissez-faire application of permits for ships, and yet they don't meet the same rigorous standards when we have concerns about privacy and some of the other things that the ETU have identified and the ACTU identified. But generally speaking, the maritime security identification case is very rigorous. There's a whole process of a security assessment by ASIO. There's many layers into it, and we've been managing this for quite a long period of time, as they have been in aviation. And there are concerns about overstepping the mark and, I guess, moving things into an area where privacy are impinged in those areas. The reality is, for every other seafarer that is servicing all of the critical infrastructure, they're only required to have what they call a maritime crew visa that you pick up in a couple of days. All that's required is basically an ID, a cursory check. There's no ability to go to the Ukraine, not the centre of governance in the world, and or regulatory overview, to go and check on who those people are, notwithstanding the fact they might be moving ammonium nitrate around the place. A lot of ammonium nitrate. We saw what it did in Beirut. They may be, we saw the live ship went down with the loss of 40, including 2 Australian vets. And it goes on and on. I don't want to go through the submission. We've identified the enormous risk in this area, our almost total reliance on it, the fact that it's deregulated. Under COVID, some of these seafarers have been there for 2 years because they can't get off. We won't let them off in case they've got COVID, and yet we don't know who they are in regards of any background check. So I guess what goes to the core of our concerns is the uneven application. And in fact, I was surprised. I've made submissions to Homeland Security in the US and in Canada in my role as the ITF president, that, gets back to this thing why there wasn't a sort of a workshop or a forensic approach to these areas of risk so that we could sit down and work out a template for mitigating it. And so it's like an extension of a type of bureaucratic negligence, I suppose, that we're just focusing on certain areas, saying, well, look, okay, we're doing the job, maybe with overreach, which is the ACTU's concern, but in other areas, we're not even on the board and don't even understand it. For example, a lot of the shipping, much of the shipping is controlled by China because they're our main trading partners. If they decide that they don't want to let those ships into China because they don't like what we're doing down here, for example, they just keep them at anchor. They control the shipping. A lot in the Act, it doesn't even identify who owns these ships. Many of them are owned by $2 companies in Luxembourg and Geneva and the Caribbean. So there's no thoroughness, or forensic thoroughness. There's not even identification, senators and members, of the real critical issues in this. And it's sort of sandpapered, or it's not sandpapered, it's wallpapered over by saying, well, look, there's all of these big concerns about Australia, an island nation, and, we need to address this as a matter of urgency. So there's this enormous gap in the middle. Most of our submission goes to that. I mean, tried to drop off a ton of cocaine in Botany Bay with a bloke who came from Tarrant Point that went to pick it up. That was only 6 months ago. Like, that's not a security infrastructure risk, that there's people aboard the ship. And the ship was a MIC, Mediterranean, one of the biggest ship owners in the world, foreign ship owners in the world. And that's the type of thing that's going on a regular basis. They're only the bits we know, and yet we're not really applying ourselves. Why? Because in the too tough basket, whereas an Australian wharfie and a seafarer who goes down there is pretty well got to jump through 1,000 hoops. The whole process of criteria continues to be revisited, more rigorous, and that's sort of, that's a legitimate area for discussion. I'm not going to. And here's this other whole area that just does not feature in any specificity other than to identify every one of those industries that almost overwhelmingly rely on those ships and those crews to deliver the essential economic, because it is essential infrastructure. That's the reality. So again, don't want to go on. Good. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Good to see some of my people that like to comment on the MUA quite widely, actually, to be able to have a level of conversation one-on-one, and we look forward to further around this. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Crumlin. I think particularly the point we heard from an earlier submitter from the US, Mr. Krebs, where he talked about their approach was to ask what would affect the continuity of the economy. And also we heard from Vice Marshal Blackburn on a similar argument about affecting the continuity of the economy, but also and supply of things like fuel, and in the case in your submission, food and grocery. It's undeniable as an island nation, the continuity of our economy relies on shipping. Your submission does recommend that this act should be applied to shipping to provide greater transparency around ownership. You also recommend that it refer to the availability of Australian ships to provide alternative transport. Just for some clarity for understanding, Vice Marshal Blackburn gave us some information regarding the number of Australian flagged vessels that are actually available for international shipping, with some comparisons to international counterparts. Are you able to just say a little bit more about that? You talked about how a lot of these ships most of these ships are foreign owned, and some of them are owned, or flagged through China. Can you just speak a bit more about that?
Well, the reality is that Australian ships pay tax. They're regulated. Some would say over-regulated. That's the ETU and the ACTU's argument. It's very expensive to do all these background checks to make sure that they meet all of those standards. So there's all these layers of cost in Australian shipping. This is servicing Australian domestic transport infrastructure, and not really, there's a larger issue in external. As we know, I've already mentioned China. I mean, if there was a little bit more forensic work when they sold the port of Darwin, they might have worked out that, the Chinese military got their oar in there. So the reality is in shipping, of course, they're dominant, and we don't know, and we're not asking. But in this specific area of Australian shipping, we're expected to clear an enormous hurdle that no one else is expected to clear. And we're competing against them in a domestic transport chain, and so is rail and road, and they're having to meet, if they're covered by, the critical infrastructure, they've got to meet all of these standards where the competition does not. So the reality is, Australia, we're losing control of those supply chains in essential things like oil, the supply of oil. We've only got 1 or 2 refineries left, so we bring it down from Singapore or Indonesia, and they're very parlous and high-risk areas, and we've got no control over that. And we've got no ability to engage in it in a constructive fashion because we've been in denial about the importance of shipping as critical infrastructure for so long, even to the extent of not even mentioning it. Like, this is Freudian, isn't it? This is a sort of a Freudian overview of policy making, that here is this critical area that everybody knows in the world, and yet we don't mention it in our security bill. So again, the ultimate thing is, with that type of policy negligence, of course, that sector of the industry of critical infrastructure, supply chain infrastructure, is withering, and we're not doing anything to mitigate the increasing risk. If it's not there, it's not controlled, it's not regulated. So, we're going to have these really high-falutin requirements for maritime workers, but no ships to put them on now. There's a public interest irony in that, isn't there? And again, we're just drawing to the attention in our humble way, that we've been saying it for a long time, that it's critical for this committee to identify, if they're serious about doing a gap analysis on this, and we want bipartisan political support in this area. We're not banging a political drum. We want to work with you, but to work with it, you've got to identify the risk in the first instances, so that we can go able to identify and clothe it with more detail. And we've got plenty of it, Senator.
Okay, great. Look, thank you so much for that. I just have one last question, and